All eyes are on Kuala Lumpur as world leaders gather for the 47th ASEAN Summit. So on this hour, we want to discuss what we can expect from this summit, both challenges and opportunities. What will top the agenda? Will internal or external issues dominate the meetings among regional and global leaders? We're also looking at what some of the analysts have been discussing leading up to this summit. Some analysts call for ASEAN to perhaps rethink their hedging strategy amidst global power rivalry, while others stress that this approach may just be crucial for the bloc's survival. To unpack some of these key questions and what we can expect from this summit, we're joined by Professor Phar Kim Beng, Professor of ASEAN Studies, International Islamic University, Malaysia, and Director of the Institute of International and ASEAN Studies. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us this morning. We want to talk about the ASEAN Summit, of course. Maybe we can start with some of your overall general expectations, what we can expect, either challenges or opportunities.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, as you know, the ASEAN Summit is actually a combination of several summit or even senior officials meetings and ministerial meetings. Now, over the last 1 year, we have had more than 330 meetings altogether, all in. Now, the one that usually attracts the attention of people around the world is the ASEAN Summit in May. But then that was also combined with ASEAN Gulf Cooperation and China Economic Summit, followed by the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a gathering of all the foreign ministers from 27 member states, surprisingly, including North Korea. So in that sense, ASEAN is a regional organization that has successfully tried to enlist states or various stakeholders to come into the region to discuss and to get their differences resolved. Ideally resolved. But as we can see, even when President Donald Trump is in Kuala Lumpur on the 26th of October, he will be witnessing the Cambodian-Thai ceasefire, which will be formalized in the form of Kuala Lumpur Accord. But then as he does that, the following day, he's actually flying to Tokyo. And then when he's done with Japan, he will be flying to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting in South Korea. And that's where he will meet with President Xi Jinping to try to put an end to any kind of acute trade friction and tension between China and the United States. And that's the most complex challenge.
A lot of attention, of course, on President Trump, as you mentioned. But before we get to that, we want to look at some of the internal dynamics, internal issues that perhaps will top the agenda for regional leaders within ASEAN. What do you think will top the agenda for ASEAN leaders?
If one were to go according to what is listed on the preamble of the ASEAN Charter, that normally begins with "we, the people of ASEAN," then obviously at the top of the priority should be digital scamming, because there have been many victims both in the region and without. And it has actually given ASEAN an excellent branding and value, a bad name, especially in light of what has happened in Cambodia, resulting in the death of a Korean university or college student. And there is a big uproar in South Korea right now on this particular issue. So within that context, digital scamming is actually top of the priority if we go according to the concept of "we the people." And we the people would suggest that nationals from ASEAN and also from China, Japan, Korea, and 11 strategic dialogue partners, if not the whole world, have a stake in making sure that ASEAN remains vibrant, healthy, and free from digital scammings, whether it's Cambodia, Myanmar, or borders verging on Laos and Indochina.
I want to go back to an earlier point you mentioned about the Thailand-Cambodia ceasefire and how this might be formalized through an accord. What can we expect in terms of actually seeing a ceasefire holding through solidifying, because as we know, talks and negotiations, dialogues between both parties are still going on. Can we see this being put to an end, peace actually maintaining with this formalizing of the ceasefire through an accord?
Well, that's an excellent question. And then the question also has to be put in the right context, in the sense that of all the ceasefire in the world, including the armistice that you have in North Korea and South Korea from 1953 onwards, tight as it is, you still have violations. So when we look at it from that optic or from that spectrum, including the ceasefire in Israel and Gaza, what we have been told and what we have got to know is that there are violations. So even when Cambodia and Thailand can actually resolve some differences, have a very good mechanism in the form of the General Border Committee, where the generals from two sides will try to mollify and overcome the flashpoint, one cannot completely overrule the possibility, the high possibility of violations and incursion. But in the main, the ceasefire will still be retained. And that is something that we can look forward to, but not be discouraged when we see any violations of any kind.
With President Trump in attendance, how do you think this might influence the dynamics of the ceasefire and the negotiations going on, with Malaysia as well, of course, playing an important part in the negotiations?
That again is a very pertinent question, and I have to commend you accordingly. The reason I start on that note is because, as you may be aware, Trump is one of those presidents in the United States, of coming from the West, who somehow has this affinity for generals. And as long as he knows that this ceasefire is managed by the generals from two sides, there will be some kind of invisible chain of command between Washington, D.C. and Bangkok and even Phnom Penh, that the generals are supposed to get to the responsibility of ensuring that there are no armed exchange of fire. So hopefully bullets will not be traded. And as that goes further and further in producing the necessary momentum and critical mass in elevating the chances of peace, more and more victims that have been affected by the conflict in July and August will start relocating back to their residence. From reliable sources, that has been happening since August, but it has to happen in a larger number, because 300,000 people, 160,000 from Cambodia, 140,000 from Thailand, have been affected by that conflict.
With President Trump, of course, another crucial question that we have to address is to do with the US tariffs. But apart from that, another concern that comes to mind is the crisis in Gaza. Just recently, Malaysia says it will leverage its upcoming meeting with the US President Donald Trump to deepen bilateral ties and broaden strategic cooperation in trade, security and humanitarian efforts, particularly stressing on Gaza. How do you think this will play out?
Well, when it comes to Gaza, prior to October 7, 2023, from what I could gather from the likes of Professor Norman Finkelstein, at least 600 humanitarian trucks have to be at the border in order to provide the necessary food. It doesn't mean that 600s are enough, but that's the minimum each day. Now, how many trucks will be allowed to get into Gaza to provide necessary aid? That is subject to the politics and the volatility of the situation on the ground. Coming back quickly to ASEAN and what the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Datuk Sri Anwar, can do on this particular issue, I think as and when he has a successful US-ASEAN Summit on the evening of the 26th, he can actually implore or even kindly request that President Donald Trump put more attention on increasing the number of humanitarian aid and trucks that can go into Gaza to make the ceasefire sustainable and permanent.
That's to do with Gaza, but what about the question of US tariffs? How do you think ASEAN will address this? Before this, a lot of analysts were concerned whether ASEAN can act in unison to put on a united front when discussing the US tariffs. Do you think there's still room for negotiations or dialogue regarding this, or is this considered case closed?
I would say that this is not possible, a united stance, because the intra-regional trade of ASEAN itself is 23%. Now, if we were to confine intra-regional trade of ASEAN to, say, three specific countries, that would be Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, where the intra-regional trade then shoots up to about 80%, which is extremely high, then there is a likelihood of those three countries, not the whole of Southeast Asia, trying to negotiate for a standard tariff. But then, having said so, President Donald Trump has mentioned that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English dictionary. And in spite of what we may do, there is still a baseline tariff of 10% that has been imposed on Singapore. In the case of Malaysia, we have been imposed with a tariff of 19%. And the best scenario that we can look for when we have a discussion with President Donald Trump or United States is to have that 19 reduced to 10 so that we can trade on an equal basis together with Singapore and ideally with Indonesia too.
On that point of tariffs and, of course, the tariff wars between US and China, a lot of analysts have also been questioning whether ASEAN should maintain the sort of hedging strategy that it's been employing within or amidst this power rivalry. Do you think that there needs to be a rethink? What are your thoughts on this strategy? Is it crucial for the bloc to survive?
Well, as and when I speak to policymakers from Malaysia and different parts of ASEAN, I have this impression that they don't necessarily consider hedging as a realistic or practical strategy, in the sense that the politics between their countries, our country, and Washington, D.C. and Beijing are extremely volatile. So regardless of what strategy that you put in, the practicality and the occasions demand everyone to be extremely flexible. So it's not necessarily hedging, but everyone should exercise more flexibility in trying to negotiate for the best outcome. And of all the relationship out there, the one relationship that is critical to the economic and security order of the whole world is actually the Sino-Chinese, the Sino-US relationship. If ASEAN can get that relationship right, and I'm referring to the whole of ASEAN, all 10 or 11 member states, then hopefully that can become a cushion to whatever disruptive manifestation that we can see from China and United States.
Yeah. I want to move on to another perhaps internal issue that will potentially be on top of the agenda for ASEAN, talking about the crisis in Myanmar. Now, Malaysia has conveyed ASEAN support for an election in Myanmar this December. Can we expect any progress, any advancements to do with the Myanmar crisis in the summit this time around?
Well, Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim has the local stand-by as the group chair, even after the expiry of the ASEAN chairmanship. He is still seen as a statesman. So in that sense, he can engage Senior General Min Aung Hlaing of Myanmar, the leader of the junta, or what is also known as Tatmadaw in Myanmar. However, based on the information that I have, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing is one of the most hard-headed person in the region, and it's not likely to make him concede on any issues concerning the general election of Myanmar. He will proceed from December 28 onwards, and in all likelihood, the election could be pervasively fraudulent. And that will lead to the collapse of the very legitimacy that Senior General Min Aung Hlaing is looking for.
Mm. I mean, with that in mind, should ASEAN leaders act with perhaps more urgency, with more, um, uh, assertiveness?
Definitely, as it is right now, the coup happened on February 1st, 2021, and over the last few years, at the very least, we have the Jakarta Consensus, and the
Mm.
key to the Jakarta Consensus is to have a ceasefire. Now, we cannot expect a general ceasefire all across Myanmar because the Tatmadaw or General Min Aung Hlaing has not really controlled the whole of Myanmar. He has merely controlled 30% of the entire country. And
Mm.
that's one of the reasons why the general election comes into question. Because when you do not control the whole country, how can you introduce and enforce a free and fair general election? Now, within the context of what I just said, what I'm actually inferring is the fact that we have been cohabiting and coexisting with a very questionable leader and regime in Myanmar over the last 4 years. And if that is the best or the least worst scenario that we have to live up to or work with, then there's no other choice because politics is not about the perfect world. That having been said, discussions have been ongoing that instead of a special envoy to Myanmar that served only 1 year, perhaps that can be extended to 3 years to give more leeway and tenure to that person to convince Myanmar to correct itself.
Mm. I do want to talk about the Philippines' chairmanship of ASEAN next year. But before we go on to that, with the Philippines in mind, with the Myanmar context, how do you think the conflict, the crisis in Myanmar will play out with Philippines at the helm of the ASEAN chairmanship in 2026?
If maritime incident is a security concern to the Philippines, maybe what they can do is to try what has been done in Myanmar. In the case of Myanmar, for example, there is no general ceasefire, as I mentioned earlier, but there is a month-to-month ceasefire
Mm.
that has been agreed between Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim, and that has been deemed and regarded as a progress by the rest of ASEAN. If Philippines and China can have that kind of month-to-month uh,
Mm.
avoidance of incidents at sea, that can also become a form of confidence building measure. But it's up to the two countries to decide whether that is the proper modus vivendi to move forward
Mm.
so that Philippines can be a decent and stable chair rather than allowing all the daily and monthly incidents to impinge on the agenda of Philippines as the group chair throughout the year of 2026.
Mm. On that note, discussing the South China Sea, discussing what's happening in Myanmar with Thailand and Cambodia, just to reflect on what I guess I've been discussing with analysts over the past year with Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN. I've been hearing a lot from experts about the need for ASEAN to rethink its strategy, to rethink some of its overall model and concepts, especially with the consensus model. Some pointing out that it may be sort of hindrance to it acting more aggressively or faster on certain issues. You produced an article recently describing that this very patience is perhaps its own strength for ASEAN. How do you see ASEAN balancing unity with the need for more decisive action? I guess this is a question that we always discuss when it comes to ASEAN, but do you think that this is a time for ASEAN to think about that?
When you have too many leaders flying in, and these are leaders coming from the likes of Brazil, Italy, United States, then obviously it's a potpourri of different diplomatic culture. And if we were to focus very much on questioning the very mechanism that has allowed ASEAN to go forward over the decades, then that might be too much on the agenda of the respective leaders. But that having been said, the analysts that you have spoken to might have misconceived or misunderstood the concept of consensus because European Union also function on the concept of consensus too.
Mm.
The 27 member states that form European Union, does focus on consensus as a basis of the decision-making mechanism. We in ASEAN do that, but we do that to the degree that we are extremely concerned about non-intervention, when in fact non-intervention should be understood based on two pillars. One, no member states of ASEAN shall support the opposition movement of another country. Second, no member states of ASEAN shall also overtly or covertly criticize the military alliance of another country or another member state. Given that two pillar in place, non-intervention is not a taboo, actually. In fact, behind the scene, the ASEAN leaders do, quote unquote, intervene in the affairs of one another, but in a very discreet manner. And the same can be said about European Union too.
You mentioned something interesting there, how you described when you have too many leaders flying in, it becomes this sort of potpourri, as you said, of diplomacy and power play. And I guess much like how we've been discussing in this hour, how a lot of our attention has indirectly been diverted to, President Donald Trump, of course, becoming the focus of media and analysts and observers. How do you think important is it for ASEAN to control the narrative, to ensure that it's the focus should be on them and on how they navigate these issues, and not necessarily catering or kowtowing to these global powers? Do you think this is a time for ASEAN to sort of centralize and control their narrative at a time when the world is looking towards them?
The concept of centralizing the narrative would probably be too strong, in the sense that the region of ASEAN practice what is known as guided press. In other words, the media is free to report on anything that they like, but then within certain degree of decorum and propriety. And the reason why we can have this very frank and candid dialogue is precisely because we are allowed and we are encouraged to think deeply and freely on issues that impact the nation, the region, and the world. Given the fact that there is a large collection of leaders that are coming in, I think what they'll be most impressed is the freedom for the leaders to engage the media freely. I know for a fact that the Thai PBS, for instance, would be interviewing President Lula of Brazil, and when he feels that there is no censorship in Asia as badly as what the West tends to think, I think he will return a very happy man. And if Astro Awani were to interview any top leaders that fly in, and they come away believing that there has been no censorship at all, again, they will be very much encouraged by that culture and also rule of law.
Prof, we are coming towards the end. We have just about a minute or two, but I did say we want to talk briefly about how this summit is also making way for the Philippines' chairmanship of ASEAN in 2026, and then marking the end of Malaysia's chairmanship. Just some brief thoughts on how Malaysia has done a rather marvelous job of navigating many issues and conflicts throughout this year, and how it makes way for the Philippines in 2026.
Well, first of all, allow me to just make a slight correction. It's not just Malaysia that has done a marvelous job. It's actually the media of Malaysia that has also done very well. And I think you're part of that whole process. Now, the reason why I feel that there is a need to say that is because when we move into the Philippines, the media in Philippines is much more rambunctious than the ones that we have in Malaysia or in other parts of the region. And President Ferdinand Marcos would have to convince the media in the Philippines to get the narrative right, because even though he's the group chair of ASEAN, he also has to reflect and echo the concern of different countries and member states in order to come to the middle way, so to speak. And I wish Philippines all the best, but that having been said, the role of Malaysia hasn't ended, because Thailand and Cambodia continue to pine for Malaysia and even the United States role, including China, Japan, to form more defense attaché and peace observers to survey their borders. So this will be a long and ongoing process.
Yep. Plenty of stuff to look forward to, of course, in the coming days, and plenty more we'd like to discuss, but that is all the time that we have with Professor Phar. Thank you so much. That is Professor Phar Kim Beng, Professor of ASEAN Studies, International Islamic University, Malaysia. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today to tell us a little bit about what we can expect from ASEAN, some of the challenges and opportunities that we can expect in the coming days. That's all. We'll see you again in the coming days as we provide updates on the 47th ASEAN Summit.